The Seahawks clinched their first division title since 2016. Damon Harrison leaves the team, and zooming into the NFC playoff picture. Let's take it around the sound. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the Sound. Today we have episode 30. I guess zooming in has a whole new meaning these days now that we are in 2020. Well, we're almost at the end of 2020. At the time of recording this, we are one day away from 2021. We had a small Christmas break here at Around the Sound, but we are back now to wrap up the Seahawks regular season and charge on into the playoffs. This past week, we saw the Seahawks get a really important win against the Rams and clinch a division title, an NFC West division title. Now it's about playing for seeding in Week 17 for the Seahawks. We'll get to all of it today, but before that, I want to make sure that all of you are following me on me on Twitter at the Peyton Thomas, and the podcast on Instagram at Around the Sound Seattle. Keep up to date with that Instagram account. We post every time there is a new episode of Around the Sound, which of course is every Wednesday and Saturday. Every episode of Around the Sound is available on YouTube at PTOM Media. That's PTHOM space media. Or you can listen to Around the Sound wherever you get your podcast. The name of the game in Week 16 for the Seahawks was the defensive side of the ball. Think about where the Seahawks team was after the first Rams loss, really, which was in Week 10 of the regular season. The defense was terrible, historically terrible, especially in the passing attack. That defense was on pace to break the record for most passing yards allowed in an entire season. At that point in the season, Russell Wilson on the offensive side of the ball was also broken, turning the ball over several times a game. The offense was one-dimensional. Chris Carson was injured, and that certainly played a factor in that. But while he was injured, the offense was extremely one-dimensional. They did not want to run the ball, which forced Russell Wilson into more difficult scenarios, hence resulting in more of those turnovers. Since that Week 10 loss, everything has really done a 180 for the Seahawks team. At that point in the season, you were looking at a team that was falling out of that contender conversation and falling into one of those teams that's on the playoff bubble, a team like the Chicago Bears that might make it into the playoffs if they get a big win in Week 17, but are most likely going to get out in the first round. This Seahawks team has reestablished themselves as a contender, and no better sign than this game here against the Rams. It was a big test in this game, and a lot of things have improved since Week 10, but none bigger than the entire defense, and especially the pass defense. The Seahawks defense came up against the New York Jets, the New York Giants, and the Washington football team, which were all relatively bad offenses, and while they were good defensive performances, the big questions were looking forward to this Rams game. This was the game that was circled on the calendar, that this was the game the defense really needs to show up and establish themselves to get some merit. Putting up great defensive performances against teams like the Jets is a good defensive performance against an NFL team, but you're playing a team like the Jets that has had really bad offensive performances throughout the season against other mediocre defenses. This really started in Week 11 versus the Cardinals, where Carlos Dunlap won the game with a sack, a game-clinching sack, and that was the first game where people really started to look at the defense and say, all right, after the Carlos Dunlap trade, these guys are starting to get better. It was the defense that won that second game against the Cardinals in Week 11 for the Seahawks. It was not the offense that carried them to that victory. And the defense has slowly gotten better every week since then. The New York Giants, the offense really struggled, which was the only loss during that stretch. Really strong performances defensively in the Jets game, in the Washington game. Going into the Rams game, it was the first time that this healthier secondary, better linebacking core, and better D-line, all three tiers of the defense, had to face an offense that had been potent earlier on in the season. And I understand that the Rams still aren't a great offensive team. Goff isn't a quarterback that's that far above average, but it was a really important game for the division. Sean McVay is a very good head coach, and so it was going to be a tough test for the defense, and it was going to show whether these guys were real or not. And this is the same defense that back in Week 6 touched Kyler Murray only one time. It was going to come down to the pass rush and stopping the Rams offense when you get to Jared Goff. If you let Jared Goff sit back there for hours and hours on end, it becomes very difficult to stop the Rams offense, which is what happened in the first game of the season against the Rams. Goff was pressured 15 times in the first half. The defensive line in the pass rush absolutely did their job. Combine that with no run game, and rookie running back Cam Akers was out for the Rams, but the run stopping was great, which resulted in no run game. Goff continued to be pressured. The offense for the Rams never really got the ball moving effectively. There was only one pass on the day that was over 20 yards, and this is how you win games with your defense, and that's kind of what I got out of watching the Week 16 games against the Rams. We'll talk about that goal line stand in a minute, but it wasn't just about that goal line stand. It was about leading the game with your defense. It was the first game that the Seahawks really not just relied on their defense, which they had relied on their defense before, but their defense actually had to make bigger plays to stop the opposing offense. In those games against the Jets or in those games against Washington, the defensive plays is what led the Seahawks to their victory, but there were never times in that game where that victory looked really in doubt. This was the first time against a better offense, not a great offense. Again, Jared Goff is an average quarterback, but against a better coach and a better offense that has weapons, and the defense absolutely stepped up to the plate and played really, really well. It was Legion of Boom style stuff. They are not at that level yet, but that was the type of things that Seahawks fans were used to seeing. Those are the types of defensive games that those fans were used to seeing several years ago. You're starting to come full circle with a defense that still has Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright start to come right back up again and be the main part of the team. The goal line stand. I did want to talk about the goal line stand because it was the biggest momentum swinger during that whole football game. The Rams had first and goal from the 2, and play after play at all 4 downs, the Rams were just stuffed right at the line, especially on 3rd down from the 1. Jared Goff lines up, and I said to the people I was watching the game with, I was like, Jared Goff's going to QB sneak. I've seen this a million times before. I remember Goff winning games in Seattle, clinching icing games by picking up a first down with a simple QB sneak, getting at least 1 yard, if not 2 or 3 sometimes, with the Rams offensive line straight up going up and bullying the Seahawks defensive line. Not this time. A great effort from those guys, the big guys on the defensive side of the ball. And after 4th down, the Seahawks were able to stop them again. I think the Seahawks were going to win the game from that point. It was very clear that after that goal line stand, when Russell Wilson and the offense were able to get off of the goal line, so you knew that there wasn't going to be a safety, it became very clear that the Seahawks defense had just shifted all of the momentum for the game and that the Seahawks offense was going to be able to coast through to a victory after that. The jump from the defense on all 3 tiers has been very, very good. DJ Reed, a big part of the secondary that the Seahawks did not really have playing at the first part of the season. Jamal Adams and Quandre Diggs, both healthy, both playing better, both made the Pro Bowl. Jordan Brooks, the rookie linebacker, stepping into the injured spot for Bruce Irvin, looks much more comfortable now, jumping up on the season tackle ratings for the Seahawks defense. And one of the biggest jumps was that pass rush of the Seahawks D-line. I talked about it on one of the very first episodes of Around the Sound, how the Seahawks defensive line was rated dead last in the league, 32nd in the NFL. The pass rush has been very, very lethal and very dangerous these last few weeks. The amount of sacks that this defense has gotten out of themselves has been really, really impressive. They're putting up Steelers-type numbers in the last few weeks as far as getting to the quarterback and hitting. Same team that hit Kyler Murray only once during that game in Week 6 hit Jared Goff 15 times in the first half. All right, let's talk about Snacks Harrison. That's the next piece of news I wanted to get today. Look, Snacks wanted to be active. Snacks wanted to be a main part of this roster that was helping the team get into the playoffs, and he's a player that is reaching sort of the twilight years of his career, and he wants to be with a contender. He wants to make the playoffs, and more importantly, he wants to make a Super Bowl. He spent most of his career with a bad New York Giants team or a bad Detroit Lions team and never really had the chance to compete. Now that he's in one or two of the last years of his career, realizing that he's just going to have to take one more paycheck and go, he wants a chance to win a ring. He was willing to work out every week. He was willing to stay in shape, take the paycheck, and play in the games, but the Seahawks weren't ever really going to let him play 50 snaps a game. Damon Snacks Harrison wasn't going to be the main run-stopping, plugging force in the middle for the Seahawks. Jerron Reed has established himself in that role in the last few weeks, and with 1 or 2 major injuries to that defensive line, Harrison would have been thrust into that position to play 50 snaps a game. The problem for him is not playing is no fun. He wasn't even activated in the game against the Rams. Everyone else on that defensive line was pretty much healthy heading into that game. So he's not activated. He's forced onto the practice squad, takes a pay cut because he was not active and not playing. And I think at that point, Harrison just realized that it probably wasn't worth it to try to fight for his spot on the Seahawks team. He probably thinks that he could play somewhere else at another contender. We'll get to that in a minute. And get more snaps and be active every single game. And it's really too bad because he did fit into that defensive line well. And while he wasn't the player that he once was with the Lions or with the Giants, he was playing really well in the rotational snaps that he was taking in the last few weeks. It did not work out, which was too bad. Pete Carroll talked to him on Monday after the Rams game. The Seahawks did officially release him, and now the Packers are swooping in, which is kind of worst case scenario for the Seahawks. For Damon Harrison, a player who has now understood everything the Seahawks defense is trying to do, going over to a team that you might see in the playoffs, and not just playing against you, but also telling the defensive coordinator, telling Matt LaFleur, the coach of the Packers, exactly what the Seahawks defense would be trying to do to stop Aaron Rodgers and that offense. Competition at that D-line spot may have helped for Snacks being on the team in the last few weeks. I certainly think that that's part of the defensive line getting better and becoming stronger, is him, Snacks, being in that D-line room and taking more of the snaps makes those guys like Jerron Reed and Poona Ford much more hungry to work harder to get those spots. And I have to say, both Reed and Ford have been playing much better in the last few weeks. All right, let's move to the other side of the ball. Let's move and talk about the offense. Damon Harrison, by the way, has not yet officially signed with the Green Bay Packers. I will certainly tell you guys on here if he does. No official word on that yet. Packers were one of the teams he was looking at before he officially signed with the Seahawks earlier in the year. I would not be surprised to see him go there at all. We'll have to monitor that. Like I said, let's move to the offense. Russell Wilson was solid again, but not MVP caliber. It's not the same quarterback that Seahawks fans saw in the first few weeks of this season. It's not the same Seahawks offense that these fans saw in the first few weeks of the season. Pete Carroll still wants to be an offense that takes care of the football, avoids turnovers, and is a run-first team. It feels like, and I talked about the confusion in offensive identity a few weeks ago after the loss against the New York Giants. I said that Russell Wilson and Brian Schottenheimer weren't really on the exact same page as Pete Carroll as far as what they wanted the offense to be, and that was the reason that the Seahawks offense struggled so mightily against the New York Giants and ended up losing that game. I said, going forward, Pete Carroll, Brian Schottenheimer, Russell Wilson need to sit down and get together and figure out what exactly they want this offense to look like. It was clear from the beginning that as soon as Russell started turning the ball over, Pete Carroll wanted more of a power run style offense. And I think Brian Schottenheimer and Russell Wilson both looked at him and kind of decided that their offense was better set up to pass the ball because you have so many weapons in the passing game with Greg Olsen getting healthy. Of course, you have DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett on the outside. You should have had Josh Gordon back, but that is a whole nother mess for him getting suspended yet again. But back a few weeks ago, at that point after the Giants game, we saw an improvement from the Seahawks offense, and we've seen since then that Brian Schottenheimer has changed his play calling. We've seen Russ's decision-making change, and we've seen the offense adapt to what we're used to seeing out of a Pete Carroll offense in the last few years, which is getting the ball out of Russell's hands quickly, establishing the run first and foremost every game, hitting defensives with the play-action pass once the run starts working. And it took a while for the offense to get going, and it did again in this Rams game. But you can see that once you start wearing down a defense, and the Rams defense is one of the best in the NFL, eventually once you get into the second half of that game, even if Russell Wilson isn't putting up MVP numbers, if you're able to establish the run, which it was done by the Seahawks offense, it was not pretty. Chris Carson got a lot of tough running yards. Things start to eventually open up in the passing game. And this is not the way that the Seahawks offense operated in the first few weeks of the season. It's not the air raid, throw it all over the yard, expect Russell Wilson to end up with 400 yards and 3 touchdowns every single game. He's going to end up with 200 yards and maybe 1 or 2 touchdowns in a game. But it's going to be a run-based style and a run-based offense, and that is good enough to beat the Rams in Week 16, which on the other side of the ball, their offense, the Rams offense, couldn't get anything going. If you saw the Seahawks defense put up a performance like they did in the first few weeks of the season, there was no way that the Seahawks offense would have had the patience to run the ball, the patience to slowly break down this Rams offense. They would have been behind 2 scores early, similar to what happened in Buffalo, and would have been forced to try to make plays and throw the ball all over the yard and shift their offensive thinking. The defense playing well is what established, or what allowed the offense to establish the run and establish themselves later on in that game. The first half of that game was extremely boring, but it's exactly what Pete Carroll wanted. Taking 6-6 into the halftime locker room was perfect for him because Pete Carroll knew that once you came back out in the second half, as long as his defense held steady, the offense would continue to chip away at that Rams defense and eventually find openings throughout the pass game for more explosive plays. Look, most Russell Wilson MVP fans are still waiting on that offensive banner day for the Seahawks offense where everybody wakes up. DK Metcalf has another career day for 200 yards. Tyler Lockett catches a couple touchdowns and has a few incredible toe taps. Russell Wilson is gunslinging the ball all over the yard, and the offense scores 50 points. And I'm not sure if that day will ever come. In the first few weeks of the season, I figured that once the Seahawks offense got to playoff time, Russell Wilson would be back, and Russell Wilson would be doing that kind of game, and it would be a shootout type game where the Seahawks offense was leading that defense. And this is a completely different complexion of a football team on both sides of the ball. And the way that the defense is playing has guided the offense into changing their philosophy. When you have a defense that's giving up 30, 40 points a game, the offense is more likely to be forced that kind of style. You can't have 15-play drives where you run the ball and take 9 minutes off the clock. If you're losing by multiple scores, you have to get the ball down the field quickly and score in a less amount of time in order to give your offense more time to work with on the next possession. I'm not sure if Pete Carroll is willing to ever go back to that shootout type of game, throwing the ball all over the yard, and I don't think they should. Now that the offense has reestablished their identity that they absolutely lost in the game that they lost against the Giants, they have reestablished themselves as an offense that Pete Carroll likes to have, which is more of a power running offense, an offense that's more careful with the football, and a game that's going to be managed by clock management. It's going to be managed by number of possessions, and it's going to be managed by your defense, keeping your offense in the game longer into the second half until the offense can finally start to break through. This game against the Rams is exactly what that was. It was a very complete performance from both sides of the ball, and is yet another Pete Carroll style win for this defense against a division rival who beat you earlier on in the year in order to clinch the NFC West and grab one of those top 3 seeds in the playoffs. All right, speaking of which, let's look ahead to the playoffs. It is always fun to speculate a million different scenarios heading into Week 17 and figure out exactly how the seeding will break down at the end of the season. On paper, the Seahawks do not have a great chance to grab the top seed. They have a 4% chance, according to Pro Football Focus or one of those other organizations out here. But essentially, here's how to think about it. Going into the final week of the season, the Seahawks play in Santa Clara against the 49ers. No, it is actually in Arizona against the 49ers because they are not playing at home. It would be in Santa Clara, but because of 2020, because of COVID, it's in Arizona. Regardless, the Hawks play away at San Francisco. If they lose that game, no matter what happens around the rest of the league, the Hawks will retain the 3rd seed in the playoffs and match up against whoever gets the 6th seed wild card, most likely the Rams. If the Hawks win, it starts to get interesting because then it relies on what the Packers and Saints do, the other 2 teams that have already clinched their divisions and are currently sitting in the number 1 and 2 seed in the NFC. The Packers, Saints, and Seahawks will all play in that afternoon window on Sunday. The Packers are 12-3 with no tiebreakers. The Saints and Seahawks are 11-4 with tiebreakers. So in order for the Seahawks to get the 1st seed, both the Packers and the Saints will need to lose their games. If the Seahawks win their game against the 49ers and only one of the Packers or the Saints lose, Seattle would jump up into the number 2 seed ahead of whichever team loses. The Packers travel to Chicago, who are playing for their playoff lives. The Bears are sitting at 8-7. If they win, sneak into the playoffs over the Arizona Cardinals. If they lose, the Arizona Cardinals do have the chance to overtake them with a win against the Rams. The Saints travel to Carolina, a team that is down and out of it, 4-10, 4-11. I think they're 4-11 at this point. But that offense is still a little bit underrated. Mike Davis, Robbie Anderson, Teddy Bridgewater. There's certainly some teams, the teams that both the Packers and the Saints are playing, Chicago and Carolina, certainly have the capability to upset the apple cart for both of these teams. And anything is possible. I see it most likely that the Seahawks will grab the second seed. I think it's more likely for the Bears to beat the Packers. The Packers do have to travel to Chicago, like I said. Carolina could beat the Saints. That seems a little bit more far-fetched for me. But I think the Seahawks, obviously, Pete Carroll is going to be fully focused on taking care of business against the 49ers. But I think it's a positive day if the Seahawks are at least able to get that second seed. It would mean a lot, especially for the Seahawks being able to get that second home game in the playoffs if they're able to advance past the wild card round. They would most likely not have to travel to Green Bay if they are able to grab that second seed. Whatever happens after that. Like I said, Pete Carroll's going to be fully focused on playing that Week 17 game, not going to be scoreboard watching anywhere else around the league. The Seahawks, Saints, and Packers all have things to play for, so it's not a scenario similar to what the Chiefs are in, where the team is going to be resting its best players. I would not expect to see Patrick Mahomes this weekend. I would not expect to see Tyreek Hill this weekend. Like I said, if either the Packers or the Saints lose and the Seahawks are able to jump up into that second seed, it's probably a success. First seed is very, very far-fetched, but like I said, with all the scenarios still on the table, still possible. So we will have to catch all of that action on Sunday. Of course, it's the final week of the NFL regular season. Everybody is playing on Sunday. We will have another Around the Sound on Saturday to preview that final week of NFL action, preview the final Seahawks game of the regular season against the 49ers. So stay tuned for all of that. We will be back here soon. That's all we had to take care of today. So, like I said, we'll be back on Saturday here on Around the Sound. So stay safe and thanks for listening.